It's great to be back with you. The present lecture marks a real transition point in our course. A colleague of mine, who's also somebody who spends his time working on global philosophy, is fond of saying that the divide between East and West isn't really the Tigris and Euphrates, it's the Himalayas. What he means by that is something that's actually very important to take into consideration, and that is that Indian civilization is far more continuous with Semitic and Greek civilization than is Chinese and East Asian civilization. Throughout ancient history, there were connections of trade, scholarly connections, diplomatic connections, waves of conquest that linked the cultures of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and South Asia. And for that reason, when we encounter a text like the Bhagavad Gita, it's not surprising that we find some elements that resonate for us. And it's not surprising that we find links, for instance, between Stoic philosophy and Indian philosophy. On the other hand, during this ancient period, there was very little connection between China and East Asia and either South Asia or the West. And for that reason, when we move to China, as we are now and where we'll stay for the next few lectures, we'll be encountering a very different approach to life, a very different approach to philosophy, very different kind of philosophical vocabulary. And so we're making what we might see as a real transition to another great civilization. Here again, in this civilization, we're going to see an emphasis in philosophical thinking very much on a mundane life, very much on our everyday life, and very much on the social context in which we lead our lives. We're going to be beginning with an analysis of the classical Confucian tradition. And we'll see that in that tradition, we're going to have a vision according to which, if we live our everyday social life properly, we live that life in harmony with much greater principles, and that makes our lives meaningful as well as our society orderly. It's actually very important for us today to develop an understanding of these Chinese philosophical systems. After all, China over the last few decades has emerged as a major world power and a major contributor, not just to the diplomatic, military, and political order in the world, but to world culture through Chinese cultural production, in literature, in philosophy, in art, and in film. And if we're going to understand contemporary Chinese society and contemporary Chinese culture, we need to understand the classical roots of that civilization. Because, as you might begin to realize, the further we go into this, contemporary Chinese culture, however infused it may have been with socialism or with European capitalism, is very true to its Confucian roots, politically and socially. Moreover, contemporary Chinese aesthetics, you will see, are very continuous with Taoist roots. So where we are going to go in the next few lectures is through an introduction to Confucianism and then to Taoism, the philosophical tradition that arose as a kind of counterpoint and critique to the Confucian tradition that we'll be studying today. A bit later, after revisiting India, we will begin to examine the way Chinese culture inflected and was inflected by Buddhism when Buddhism arrived from South Asia. But for now, we're staying in fairly purely Chinese ideas, beginning with Confucian foundations, and then in the next lecture, as I say, moving on to Taoism. So let's begin by asking who the person we refer to in English as Confucius was. The first thing to say, of course, that Confucius is not a Chinese name. It's in fact a Latinization of the name Confuzi or Kongzi, which is how Confucius is known in China. And I will often refer to him as Kongzi or Confuzi to be true to the Chinese. We'll talk about who he was very shortly. Following a bit of a biographical introduction, I'm going to go through some of the basic topics in the text that we have from Confuci, the Analects, talk a bit about the structure of that text and the framework of Confucian theory, and then we're going to begin looking at the specifics of Confucian philosophical ideas, the discussion of filial piety, a discussion of the relationship between social context and virtue, ritual propriety, the Confucian understandings of harmony with the universe and of effortless action or wu wei, and then try to synthesize a global conception of virtue on a Confucian account. So let us begin by asking who Kongzi himself was. The term Kongzi, by the way, just means Master Kong. So his name would have been Kong. Zi is an honorific term. He lived in approximately the 5th century before the Common Era. And to get together with our chronology, that means right at about the time that the Mahabharata was being composed, or at about the time that the Buddha was living, at about the time of Socrates. So we're looking at a tradition that's coeval with the Greek tradition that we've examined, the Sanskritic tradition that we've examined. We're kind of going back to the same period. And incidentally, possibly at about the same time that the book of Job was finalized. So all of these things are happening at about the same time in different parts of the world. In China, though, this was a period of tremendous social and political ferment. Kongzi lived in a time when there was a great deal of war between the small feudal states that made up China. We have to remember that China at that point was not a unified nation state as it is now. Rather, it was a culturally unified region that comprised a number of very small or sometimes medium-sized states that were often in conflict with one another. And this created a great deal of social tension and discord, but also a lot of fertile cultural development. Kongzi himself was a native of the state of Lu, and he seems to have come from a family of middle-class bureaucrats, low-level functionaries in the vast civil service of the typical Chinese state of Lu. He had a lot of students, and that seems to be apparent, and many of his students rose to considerably high ranks in the civil service. His own views seem to have been very conservative. He constantly looked back to an imagined golden age in China, an age in which he characterized Chinese culture as orderly, as peaceful, in which people were virtuous. And so it contrasted dramatically in his moral imagination and in the moral imagination of his followers with the then contemporary state of China as one involved in war and in chaos, in deceit, in diplomatic intrigue. And so living in this time of turmoil, Confucius thought of an ideal in terms of this imagined golden age. Beyond that, we know almost nothing of Confucius' life. There are various conflicting biographies, but no reliable information. So we want to think of him as this somewhat scholarly, somewhat conservative petty bureaucrat who, with tremendous erudition and apparently a lot of personal charisma, gathered around him a group of students who became influential and propagated his views. Now, the text that we have from which we know Confucius' philosophy is called the Analects, or the Teachings. It wasn't in any sense written down by Kongzi. It was compiled long after his death, and we don't even know quite how long after his death different parts of it were compiled. It seems to have grown and developed over a period of centuries, like so many of these classical texts that we're reading. It's a collection of the recollections of his students, of his conversations, of events involving his life, of things he was fond of saying. There's no clear sense that it was compiled by a single editor or a single author, and there is no clear reason to be confident that any of these reports in the Analects are actually historically accurate. The authorship is vague. Some of them may have been made up after the fact. Some of them might be verbatim transcripts. We really don't know. It is clear from its style and dissemination in China that the audience for the Analects was an audience of Chinese aristocrats and public servants. It was a text composed in very erudite classical Chinese, aimed at an educated audience, aimed at helping people achieve the kind of cultivation expected of public servants in classical China. The text itself takes as its goal the characterization of what we might call a humane, cultured life. In this sense, it's very similar to the Nicomachean Ethics in trying to characterize the life of an aristocratic gentleperson in a well-ordered society. The Analects relies on a particular set of key philosophical ideas. And I want to talk about each of these in turn. They're all a bit foreign to us. They're all Chinese concepts that don't have exact analogs in Western philosophical thinking. And I'm going to ask you to work to wrap your mind around them and to try to settle yourself into a somewhat different worldview, a somewhat different set of concepts, and to relax into that view so that the Confucian framework we spell out will make sense. The first of these is actually the most familiar of the bunch. And in Chinese, we call it Ren. And Ren means humanity, warm-heartedness, a kindly disposition to others, generosity. In general, being a mensch. That's what we mean by Ren. The second, though, is Li. Ren and Li are the two big ones, but the others will be important too. The term Li means ritual propriety or correctness. Now, Chinese court society was highly ritualized, and so Li had to do with behaving in these very carefully prescribed ways. But it's broader than that. We could think of Li as meaning etiquette in a very clear sense. Not only formal etiquette in studied and formalized interactions, but also etiquette in our everyday personal interactions with one another. As we'll see, for a Confucian, Li, or etiquette, ritual propriety, correctness, is an extraordinarily important dimension of a decent life. The third is Dai. We can understand Dai as meaning virtue, not in the technical Aristotelian sense, a mean between extremes, but honesty, integrity, moral rectitude. So we think of Dai as moral rectitude. Notice that that's different from mere ritual propriety or politeness or etiquette, different again from warm-heartedness or humanity. It involves obeying the moral strictures of one's society. Fourth, we have a very central Confucian doctrine, one which anybody who's familiar with Confucianism will recognize immediately, and one that importantly animates Chinese society, and that is shao, or filial piety. That is the respect that children have for their parents, and in general, respect for elders and respect for authority. Then we have Tian, which literally means heaven, but it means the nature or order of the universe. The idea that one of the principles with which we want to try to comport ourselves is the orderliness of the world. And finally, and one that will play a great role, not only in Confucian theory, but as we'll see, interpreted somewhat differently in Taoism, is the notion of wu wei, sometimes translated as non-action, but I prefer to think of it as spontaneity or effortlessness, the kind of effortlessness that we see in totally cultured professionalism, say in music or sport, where we see somebody acting spontaneously in a way that completely hides the years of training that led to it. So spontaneity or effortlessness, wu wei, is the final of these. We're going to see this set of concepts animating the Confucian idea. Now, we should be careful not to overgeneralize, because of course the Confucian tradition wasn't uniform. It starts with a complex of ideas developed in the Analects, and it evolves considerably over Chinese history. There's some religious aspects to Confucianism, but we're going to be largely ignoring those. It's primarily a social philosophy, and we'll be focusing on the doctrines as they emerge from the Analects themselves, as opposed to the later Neo-Confucian schools. If you reflect upon contemporary Chinese society, you will see that these ideas very much animate Chinese culture today. So, as I said, the Confucian framework aims to cultivate individual excellence, but individual excellence in a social context, and attempts to provide a kind of ideal of a literate, cultured aristocrat. We're going to see that humanity, Ren and Dai, that is warm-heartedness and virtue, according to the Confucians, is an achievement of character, just as Aristotle would have thought, to be accomplished through practice and tutelage and proper training, and eventually manifested in effortless excellence in wu wei. So this cultivation always requires, and in turn supports, a social order grounded in the family and in well-ordered social institutions. Li and Shao, ritual propriety, and filial piety are the foundations of this order. They're what hold things together. And the social order, in turn, reflects this kind of cosmic order, or Tian. And filial piety rests at the bottom of this because the family for the Confucians is always the foundation of the social order. So now let's turn to the text itself. And we're going to read from the Analects and see how Confucius, or the voice of Confucius in the Analects, expresses these. Master Yo said, "A young person who is filial and respectful of his elders rarely becomes the kind of person who is inclined to defy his superiors. And there has never been a case of one who is disinclined to defy his superiors stirring up rebellion. The gentleman applies himself to the roots." Might we not say that filial piety and respect for elders constitute the root of goodness? This is a lovely and very clear exposition of the special role that filial piety plays in the foundations of Confucian theory. The idea is that we learn respect for our elders and obedience and conformity to order in the family, and that behavior is then exported to produce a harmonious society. And so a society that can provide the context for lives that can themselves be well-ordered, well-planned, and productive. Similarly, for Confucians, proper social interaction grounds this stability. Let's read from 1.4. Master Sheng said, "Every day I examine myself on 3 counts. In my dealing with others, have I in any way failed to be dutiful?" So the first question is, have I respected virtue or day in my dealings with others? In my interaction with associates, have I in any way failed to be trustworthy? Again, focusing on this notion of virtue as involving interaction. And finally, have I in any way failed to put into practice what I teach? That is, once again, this notion of practice as the place where virtue is manifested. Confucius himself is quoted in this respect a bit later in the text as saying, "The master said," the master is always Confucius, by the way, "to guide a state of 1,000 chariots, be respectful in your handling of affairs and display trustworthiness." That is, if you're going to be respected as a leader, you need to handle your interpersonal relationships well. Otherwise, you don't have the kind of respect necessary to lead a state. And later, the master said, "A young person should be filial when at home, respectful of his elders when in public. If he has any strength left over after manifesting these virtues in practice, let him devote it to learning the cultural arts." So once again, respect is the foundation. Propriety, or as we've put it sometimes, etiquette, is also essential. And notice how the Confucians emphasize this. Another lovely passage in the Analects. The master said, "Oversee them with dignity, and the people will be respectful. Oversee them with filiality and kindness, and the people will be dutiful. Oversee them by raising up the accomplished and instructing those who are unable, and the people will be industrious." So again, these ideas of li, of propriety, is extraordinarily important for social order. Confucius continues on this theme, and this is one of my favorite lines. It's actually kind of fun. Confucius said of the Ji family, we don't know who they are, but we can tell what he thought of them. "They have 8 rows of dancers performing in their courtyard. If they can condone this, what are they not capable of?" What's going on here? It's actually a lovely line. The point is that the Ji family presumably was not of a social order that entitled them to 8 rows of dancers. Maybe they were only entitled to 6. And if they were willing to do something that was this impolite, this improper, this gauche, this nouveau riche, what are they not capable of? The point is that if their li, if their propriety isn't in order, who knows how their ethics stand? So li requires great cultivation, careful cultivation, and is essential to excellence in life. Zhigong said, "Poor without being obsequious, rich without being arrogant. What would you say about someone like that?" The master answered, "That is acceptable, but it's still not as good as being poor and yet joyful, rich and yet loving ritual." Zhigong said, "An ode says, 'As if cut as if polished, as if carved, as if ground. Is this not what you have in mind? The master said, Zhigong, you are precisely the kind of person with whom one can begin to discuss the odes. The important line here is, as if cut, as if polished, as if carved, as if ground. That's the Confucian ideal of personal development and upbringing, polishing the human being like a gem. Li, then, is a kind of cultivating force. Li has to be cultivated, but it also cultivates a human being. Just like Aristotle on virtue. Virtue has to be cultivated, it cultivates us. Wu Wei, this notion of effortless action or spontaneous action, is dead center as well. And I'd like to read you a passage or two about Wu Wei. Here we are from Book 2 of the Analects. The master said, one who rules through the power of virtue is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in place and receives the homage of the lesser stars. You're going to see an echo of this later in the Tao Te Ching, but the idea is that successful mastery, successful ruling, successful administration requires a kind of minimization of effort, not heavy-handedness. The good ruler, the good administrator stays in the background. And this kind of Wu Wei, this effortlessness, is conducive to social order. A nice passage here. The master said, if you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves. The idea here is, again, that successful leadership requires a kind of soft hand, requires exemplifying the virtue that you want and inspiring people, not threatening them and disciplining them. This is something that I think is a useful thing for anybody involved in administration to remember. When I've had to run a department, I've often turned to Confucian and Taoist theory for guidance in administration, and I find it really useful. Wu Wei also involves a kind of spontaneity and harmony. And here's a lovely point. The master said, the gentleman harmonizes and does not merely agree. The petty person agrees, but does not harmonize. This notion of harmony as opposed to agreement, I think, is really important, and it's a very nice distinction. To harmonize with others is to work together with them. It sometimes requires disagreement or offering contrary views or complementary views, but working to a common end with respect, propriety, etiquette, and a common sense of purpose and order. Agreement can sometimes be counterproductive. It can mean being a yes man. A petty person may do that. That might sound like behaving harmoniously. It might sound like being polite. It might sound like it's virtuous or even filial. But the point is that it's not. Harmony requires more than that. It's hence a subtler and more cultivated state of mind than that of simply being disposed to agree. Moreover, we want to emphasize that this notion of Confucian goodness, animated by this set of constructs that we've been discussing, filial piety, mandate of heaven, virtue, and so forth, is a very global characterization. It's not a single dimension of human life. Here's a very nice example for that. Meng Wu Bo asked, is Shilu good? Now, by the way, I have no idea who Shilu was. The master replied, I don't know. In a state of 1,000 chariots, Shilu could be employed to organize the collection of military taxes, but I do not know whether he is good. What about Ran Kui? Well, the master replied, in a town of 1,000 households, or an aristocratic family of 100 chariots, Ran Kui could be employed as a steward, but I do not know whether he is good. What about Xin Hua? Standing at his proper place at court, with his sash tied, Xin Hua would be employed to converse with guests and visitors, but I do not know whether he is good. Now, what's going on here? In each of these cases, Confucius is asked by his disciples, is this person good? And in each case, Confucius says, he's got certain good qualities. There are certain local qualities that I know about him. But overall goodness, involves having all of these good qualities harmoniously unified, being cut, polished, ground like a gem, and I don't know from what I've seen whether all of that is in place. Compare this, if you will, to that lovely Aristotelian line, "One swallow does not make a summer, nor does a single day." The other thing we need to remember is that this global dimension of goodness is always, for Confucian, social in character. Shigong asked about goodness, and the master said, "When in public, comport yourself as if receiving an important guest, and in your management of common people, behave as if you were overseeing a great sacrifice." That is, these Confucian virtues are always manifested, first and foremost, most importantly, in our social interactions with others. Comporting ourselves as receiving an important guest, behaving as though we're overseeing a great sacrifice, even if it's a simple, ordinary social interaction. You can tell that somebody's classy in a Confucian sense by how they behave in ordinary interactions. So let's sum some of this up. In this Confucian framework, we've seen certain similarities to the framework of the Gita and to that of the Stoics. That is, the Confucian, like the classical Indian theorist, like the Stoic theorist, sees human life as meaningful when it is aligned with the divine, when it is aligned with heaven, Tian, because there's this overarching order that constrains and makes sense of our lives and our world. On the other hand,